Everyone, welcome to the Eating at a Meeting podcast live. This is another week. We're on the last Wednesday of February. We're the last Wednesday of February, and some great speakers and guests this month, I should say. And so thank you for being here. I am your host, Tracy Stuckrath of Eating at a Meeting and founder of Thrive Meetings and Events, where I help organizations around the world create safe, sustainable, and inclusive food and beverage experiences. So on today's show, I'm so excited to introduce you to Len Senater. He is the founder of the Depanneur. I mutilated it again. Tried it. The Dep in Toronto. He is also the co-founder of the Newcomer Kitchen, a nonprofit food project that supported Syrian refugee women, and the author of the forthcoming book, Depanneur Cookbook, to be published by Simon & Schuster in 2023. Hey, Len, how are you?
Hello, thanks for having me. This was really fun.
I'm so sorry I mutilated. I did practice, So tell us a little bit about yourself and what is the Dep and how did you get into this?
Okay, well, so the Depanneur is a venue that I started in Toronto, which was designed to showcase the incredible diversity of culinary talent in the city, both amateur and professional. So it became a venue dedicated to hosting pop-up food events. And over the course of 10, 11 years, we hosted thousands of unique food events, from drop-in dinners to sort of sit-down supper clubs to classes and workshops and brunch residencies and private events and all of these things in a tiny 450 square foot renovated corner store that was home to all of this stuff. And then we were hosting all of these different types of food events. I basically had this peculiar kind of restaurant that invites total strangers to do all the cooking. And so in 2016, when the Canadian government decided to invite 25,000 Syrian refugees to resettle, a lot of them were kind of stuck in hotels being processed, waiting to find housing. And at that time, they had no kitchens and no way to prepare food for themselves or their family. And so I was like, well, I have this space, I have this kitchen. Why don't we just extend the invitation to them? They could make some familiar food, share a meal, bring some leftovers home for their friends. And we did, and that sort of took off, and it became a multi-year pilot where we invited Syrian women to come prepare food, sell it to the community, and then pass the money to them and use this as a bridge to create social and economic opportunities.
That's amazing. And I love the fact, you just said it basically, but when I posted it on Facebook into one of the Facebook groups about food and society, you're like, I'm a person who has hosted 1,000 dinner parties and worked with hundreds of amateur and professional cooks from all over the world. Drop me a line if you want to talk to me. And I just love it. And a couple people gave, totally thumbs up. We want to hear about this. So, and I just think it's really, just before the show started, you and I were chatting about what the word pop-up is, because an event is kind of a pop-up, but this is really more restaurant related and more of that amateur chef. So talk a little bit about what a pop-up, because people might not understand what a pop-up is, because it's here and there, and it's gone. Yeah.
Well, I became interested in the phenomenon so I used to be a designer for many years, and then I took a sort of transition. I wanted to kind of get involved, and I've always kind of gone through life stomach first, and so I sort of decided that I wanted to do something involving food, but I wasn't sure exactly what that was, and became intrigued by this phenomenon of pop-up dining that I saw happening in other cities around the world, where a restaurant would spring into existence for one night or 1 week or 1 month in a particular place before vanishing. And it seemed like there was a lot of really fun and interesting possibility sort of on the margins or outside the formal restaurant model. And I became intrigued. There was one in San Francisco called the San Francisco Underground Market, which was like a night market, but it was really focused on talented home cooks rather than on sort of established or professional chefs. And that really intrigued me. I've always liked home cooking better than fine dining. And so this was really my bag. And I knew that I didn't want to frantically cook the same thing every day for people I never get to meet, so this idea really appealed to me. And then I tried to find more pop-up things happening in Toronto, and I found them basically extremely rare. And I was trying to figure out why that was. And I kind of came to the conclusion that it was so prohibitively expensive to set up the infrastructure to do a pop-up, like a one-off pop-up event, that you needed tons of money just to do it, and then the resulting event had to be really expensive to cover all those costs, and so that only people with tons of money could go to them, and then the whole thing becomes this kind of insular elitist thing that just didn't interest me. So I was like, well, what if I actually had a dedicated venue that had everything you needed, so you
Right.
didn't have to reinvent that wheel? Then you could like radically lower the barrier to participation, and you could have a far more interesting and diverse group of people come and cook, and then the resulting events could be a lot more modest, and you could have a far more interesting and diverse group of people come and dine.
Hmm.
And I kind of ran with that idea.
And so did you go searching out for these, or did people just start coming to you?
It was a mix, right? Like, so in the early days, I mean, people didn't know. So I would go to like, food truck events or pop-up food markets or night markets, or
Hmm.
put the word out and invite. I say, hey, I think what you're doing is awesome. We should come and do a night at my place, and we can do a dinner. And, and it kind of built it up slowly and organically. And I mean, I did kind of bank on the idea that the notion itself was inherently viral in a certain way. You come
Right.
to this dinner party, you have this dinner by some amateur cook, you're like, oh, this is awesome. Oh, I know somebody who would love to do this. Right. And
Right.
so they would pass the word. And so over the years, as I built an audience, and that audience sort of evangelized what we were doing, and it became more known and seen, then it became this mix of my outreach, but also people finding out about it and coming to me. And we were able, I mean, what was remarkable is for 11 years, we just kept it full, like almost every day of the week. There was never a shortage
Wow.
of talent.
That's amazing. And with the when you brought the Syrian refugee women in there,
Mhm.
was that like every single day that you did that, or is that once a
Well,
week,
again,
or
it started off just as a small gesture of
right?
hospitality. It was like,
Hmm.
come use the kitchen,
Right.
and it was a remarkable story because we didn't know anything about the situation. I was just like, we wanted to help, but didn't know how. I'm like, I have a kitchen, so just start where you are, use what you have, do what you
Right.
can. So I'm like, we finally found a way of getting the word out through this. It was me and the co-founder, Kara Benjamin Pace, put the word out. It landed with this remarkable young Syrian couple, Rahaf and Ismail. They took the word back to their hotel, and they basically organized a little field trip to do some cooking. And they came down on a cold April morning, and they didn't
Uh-huh.
hit some of them. For some of them, it was the first time they'd ever left the hotel, they'd ever ventured into the city, ever
Wow.
been on the public transit system. It was like, talks about how strong the draw of the
Right.
kitchen really is. And then they came and they weren't sure, what is this whole weird thing? And I was just like, you know what, guys, just cook whatever you want. We'll talk about it later. And once they realized that they could cook, they were just like, get out of my way. And they just sort of took over the whole kitchen. And all of a sudden, all this like pots are bubbling and all the people are laughing. And it was clear that we were just doing a great thing. And so we just kind of did it. No particular plan. And then, it picked up a lot of momentum. People, certainly within the Depanneur community, been doing that for about 5 years. I've been running the Depanneur for about 5 years at that point. And so we had a community. They were super enthusiastic. Everybody was excited about it. So we're like, all right, let's do it again. And let's do it again. And then at a certain point, I'm like, okay, I was just sort of paying for it, just because whatever. And then I'm like, I can't afford to actually do this. And they were also at this point being relocated into homes. And so now they
Okay.
had kitchens. So we had sort of addressed the first sort of core uh, issue that had arose. Now the second issue was like, can they actually make any income from this? Is there any job opportunity here? So we're like, well, I already sell event tickets on my website. I mean, I've been doing this for many years. Let's see if we can do this in a way that makes enough money to pay for everything. And so we just started to say, okay, we're going to make some extra meals. They're available for sale. Who wants them? And there was just this huge enthusiasm for the idea. And so we were able to quickly scale it up to making 50 meals once a week. Would be about a group of about 6 to 8 ladies. They would come in, they would prepare 50 meals, we'd package everything up, we'd sell them into the community, and it paid for enough to pay for all the ingredients and the overhead, and then be able to split, to distribute all of the proceeds to the women, and they were able to, go home with pocket money and economic and
Wow.
social engagement and all of this amazing support from the community that really felt fundamentally respectful and equitable. It wasn't an act of charity. It wasn't
Hmm.
it was like they were earning this money, contributing something valuable that the market was really thrilled to actually come up and purchase. And it was
Right.
a really great exchange.
Now, two questions for that. The age range of the women cooking, was it young women, older women?
It was huge. I mean, a lot of them at the beginning were actually bringing their young kids because the women were primary caregivers. So you had like, young mothers with their young kids, and then you had like older mothers. We really had like a generate from like early, like late teens to like 80s. Like we really had
Wow.
a gigantic range. And I'll also add out, this is an incredibly diverse group of women. I mean, you have, and that's the thing about refugees, is it's not, you get this incredible cross section of the community, many of whom would never have necessarily hung out at home. So you have, university educated Damaski urban professionals and illiterate peasant farmers and, Druze and Christians and all
Wow.
different stripes of Muslim and all of these people who in many ways have nothing in common, yet have this fundamental thing in common. And
Mhm.
so they actually kind of came together in this space and there was as much connection within the community as there was a bridge between the Syrian community and the Canadian community. So one of the things that emerged that was really fascinating to see.
Well, and you had the Prime Minister Trudeau come.
Yeah.
And how did that go?
Well, I mean, so, this thing picked up a lot of momentum over the
Mhm.
first year that we were doing it. It became sort of local news and then national news and then international news as a sort of, showing a sort of response to this global
Mhm.
humanitarian crisis that was, that it was a feel-good story about a feel-bad situation. And so it had a hook. People liked it, and
Right.
it didn't take a lot of figuring out to see why this was a good thing. So people
Right.
saw it and they're like, yeah, this is great. And so there was when the 1 year anniversary of the Syrians' arrival in Canada uh, came around, the prime minister at the time was looking for a way to sort of mark that occasion, and was looking for somewhere in Canada that they felt sort of was emblematic of this new community, and they chose this project to host this sort of roundtable. And so, yeah, at that time we had a visit from the prime minister, and it really spoke to kind of what was possible out of this tiny little corner store with a handful of ragtag people. It's
Right.
not that the project didn't have its challenges, and as we tried to figure out how to pay for it, because I mean, it covered its costs, but
Right.
there was no money to run the actual program. So,
Gotcha.
we needed to figure out a way to support the running of it, and that represented a big challenge. And so we were taking advantage of the promotional or publicity
Right.
opportunities that we had as we tried to navigate towards turning it into a legitimate and sustainable nonprofit organization.
Now, one of the questions that we had chatted about beforehand was how this enabled you to build community through the food, and you kind of touched on that. But
Mm.
I mean, you've got farmers and different people, and so,
Mhm.
and I think you said it's like it really did bridge the Canadian community with this new
Yeah.
Syrian, their new Syrian
Yeah.
members of the community.
Well, it was an extension of what the Depanneur already did. I mean, this was
Right.
one particular pilot project that we ran, that ran once a week for a few years, and it became a very high profile part of what we did, but it was built on a multi-year history of hosting
Right.
dinners and hosting events that invited all kinds of different people from all different places in the world to share their food and culture and culinary ideas in this sort of fun, intimate, and directly accessible experiential way.
Right.
And so, the core values of connecting people through food, creating economic opportunity through grassroots food engagement, and all of these sort of things, and diversity and inclusion through participation in food, and lowering the barriers to access, and all of these ideas just found their kind of ultimate expression in this particular project. But it was something that ran
All the time.
from
Yeah.
the beginning and continued even after the project moved on from the Depanneur.
That's so it's still running, just
It's
not
still
there.
running as a
Yeah.
nonprofit organization in Toronto. I mean, it had to evolve for a number of
Right.
reasons. It had to evolve because, well, how long are you a newcomer after how many years, right? And how
Right.
do we extend this benefits to newcomers?
Right.
Also, we had to adapt into the reality of, we had to become what it had to become what the government was willing to fund,
Gotcha.
right? Which was
Okay.
different than what necessarily we had originally done. And we were facing a different challenges in a different
Mhm.
context. So, it's now under the executive directorship of Kara Benjamin Pace, and Tamar Chaikin is the sort of managing director of the sort of general activities, the operations, and it has its own its own thing, and it's developing cohorts of diverse multicultural women and doing entrepreneurship training.
That's amazing. Now, and before, there were so many fascinating things you said to me just before we came on, like on here and actually before, but food is more than just food.
Mm-hmm.
And talk to the listeners about what that means to you.
Well, I mean, there probably isn't a dimension of human culture and experience that food doesn't touch or intersect with in some way. I mean, it's the most fundamental, most universal of all human experiences. There's never been a person in any time in all of history that doesn't eat. So it's something we fundamentally all have in common. And as such, it leaps across these barriers of language and culture and age and race and gender and class and history and things to find the sort of common ground. I think James Beard said food is our common ground.
Yep.
And so, but what does the traditional restaurant do that actually takes advantage of this remarkable and unique thing that food is capable of? And so that's the part that really intrigued me. And I would look at a restaurant, you go, you order, you eat, you leave, and it's kind of a missed opportunity to do something. And so I was more interested in doing that thing than I was in the food itself.
Right.
And so to dive deeper into the places that food intersects with other stuff, one of the events that we used to host was a series of table talks. So once a month, I'd invite a guest speaker to come and talk on some subject that they were passionate or interested about. And that would be the once a month that I would cook. So I would make up a menu because I'm not a chef, but I can cook, and I enjoy it. But I would come up with a menu that was sort of reflected or embodied the themes or topics of their talk. And then we would invite everyone to come and have a dinner and then listen to the person talk and have this kind of informal dinner table Q&A. And so we could actually dive deeper into all kinds of different issues, whether it's food and literature or food and history or food and politics or, and so, yeah, that's about that. So I've always believed that food is more than just food. And as such, the Depanneur was more than just a restaurant. Food, so a restaurant was more than a restaurant. And we have this cookbook coming out, which is our sort of COVID project. And I think it'll be more than just a cookbook.
Well, I think so too. And you had told me that you had written 90,000 words.
Yeah, the only piece of writing advice I was given the entire time was keep writing. So I did, and then it turned out to be way too much. So I have a whole separate book now that one day might find a thing. And now I've sort of been tasked at the last minute to write the Coles notes of that book to include as the introduction for the actual cookbook. And that's going well. We're getting very, very close to the final deadline. So I'm happy with how that's coming together. So we're going to, we'll talk a little bit about the origin story of the Dep and a little bit of the philosophy and manifesto of the Dep. And then there's going to be a section sort of talking to Newcomer Kitchen as a sort of, piece on its own. And in this, it's all being wrapped around 100 different recipes from 100 different chefs from 80 different nationalities, whom we all interviewed as well, and I sort of extracted some of their stories. So it's kind of become this sort of like Humans of New York, of food, of Toronto, right, in conjunction with this cookbook and this story of this very unlikely restaurant and the little corner store that could.
I like that, the little corner store that could. So out of some of those stories, what's one story that just really resonates with you?
Wow, there's so many. It's hard to. That's one of the challenges when you host thousands and thousands of these events. I mean, we were in the sort of peak period. We were doing. I was more or less single-handedly doing 300 events a year in my space. So there was a lot going on, and it was from weddings to dinner parties to all these things. I mean, one of the things that we did was a few years ago, Canada was celebrating its ostensible 150th anniversary of its formal establishment. They called it Canada 150. And I just felt that was such a sort of short-sighted kind of description. It's what we're calling Canada has been doing this a lot longer than that. And so I actually reached out to Taylor Parker, who's a remarkable Indigenous chef, and said, can you come and do a Canada Day dinner called Canada 1500? Because I really think we need to reframe what we're talking about here. And that was an incredibly interesting experience. And so I invited him back as a sort of chef of honor every Canada Day since then. And And then one of the interesting things that he was always like reluctant, because he does a lot of like hunting and foraging as
Okay.
part of his things, and he was always reluctant to like give me an exact menu, right? And I was like, no, no, no. But if I don't have the menu, how are people going to buy tickets? They want to know. And he's like, but that's not how it works. And anyway, so we kind of would compromise. And then I remember we had one event where it's called Hunt and Gather, and he was going to actually take some other chefs on this like ice fishing trip and hunting thing, and then they were going to come back and cook all the stuff that they made. And I was like, great. And I was writing all the stuff up, and then they went and they didn't catch anything. Right. And then sort of without actually telling me, he's like, yeah, that's why I don't give you that, because that's not how the supermarket of Mother Nature works. You
Right.
don't get to eat whatever you want whenever you want. And that actually made me realize just sort of how deeply colonial like the whole restaurant model really is, to just assume that I can eat the same thing all the time, anytime, whenever I want, no matter whether it's in season, no matter where it comes from. And maybe even re-examining that is something we kind of need to move towards.
Well, and that just jumps me to the standard banquet menus that you get at hotels and convention centers. Here's the Italian, here's the Mexican, here's the Asian buffet, and this is what you're going to get, right? We need to come back to kind of doing that hunting gathering. What can we get locally, right?
Yeah, and like, I mean, Dan Barber talks a lot about it in his book, The Third Plate. There's a lot of ideas that we need to kind of like reconsider cost and convenience as the primary driver of our food choices, and look more at both what positive sort of intervention that food can do in our choices of what we procure and where and how and why. And we as consumers of food need to be more interested in and also be willing to make little compromises around what we eat and when, because this is our sort of participatory dialogue with the environment, with the terroir, and then the chefs use their skill and their knowledge and their expertise to make that delicious, right?
Right.
And so I think all of us working together can try to sort of shift the focus of food and how we engage with it, and try to help it be more of a force for positive change and less of a force for the sort of negative and unsustainable sort of status quo.
Yeah, I mean, it's that institutional dining, not just with restaurants, but we were talking about it before the show, with hospitals and whatever, and how we can, instead of it being the number one expense for a meeting planner, how can we use it as a tool to do those connections?
Well, I think you can really try to align, like if you're having a particular event, what is the function or purpose of that event? Right? Is it a wedding that you're trying to create this sort of like wish fulfillment, sort of luxury fantasy? Is it a corporate event where you're trying to like motivate people and get them connected and engaged? The team building. I mean, and then to sit down with the chef, right, or with the planner and say, how can we use food to get everyone in that event closer to whatever that goal is a much better use of food than just to like stuff something in your pie hole until the next meeting, And so again, in the same way that the restaurant was a missed opportunity to connect people, I think sort of these standard menus that you're talking about are a missed opportunity to reach the goals of whatever your event is actually doing.
Right, exactly. And that takes a lot of different change from a lot of different perspectives, from institutional corporate buying to regional buying and chefs and what they're trained on, and how they do that, and then meeting planners thinking about it a lot more purposefully.
I mean, I find like for even something like being involved in the preparation of the food is probably one of the most profound team building activities that you can actually do. I mean, collectively cooking something, which is essentially how everything was cooked from almost all of human history, right, is the way we form connections and bonds and trust and figure out who's got which skills, and it's all done. And then you sit down and share immediately the result of your collaboration. That connects people in a way that, like, doing a trust fall, or I don't know, whatever kind of like thing, playing laser tag or, is just not going to do. And so here it is. Food could be doing the very thing that you're having your event to do better than your event if you were just to use food to do it.
That's so like I want to do that. I just want to make that happen just instantaneously, right? You had on your Twitter description that I loved it is a place where interesting food things happen.
Yeah.
And I think that what you just said kind of reiterates that.
Yeah. So that's sort of the slogan of the Dep. And it sort of ties into this idea that, it's not about like the fanciest dish. It's never going to be the same. I couldn't even get a restaurant review because we never served the same thing twice. Right. So it's like to call it a restaurant didn't really work because it just was something else. So that was the only way I could kind of summarize it in a couple of words.
Right.
But it was also it also ties to the name of the place. So just for those who don't know, so the Depanneur, I'm actually calling you now from Quebec, from a friend's house where I'm staying in Quebec. And I'm originally from Montreal myself, even though I live in Toronto now. And in all of in Quebec and French Canada, the Depanneur is what you call the corner store, right?
Okay.
It's the slang, the way you'd say bodega or convenience store or whatever. That's in Quebec. And so it's unique to Quebec. The etymology is kind of interesting. So if you were like driving down the street and your car breaks down, you might say, "Oh, je suis en peine," meaning like I'm stuck, I'm in trouble, I'm in a jam.
Okay.
So the dépanneur is the person who comes and gets you unstuck or out of trouble.
Oh, I love
right?
that.
And so I guess in Quebec, in France, it would be like a tow truck driver or like a roadside assistance would be a dépanneur. But in Quebec, it was like, I guess someone was like, "Oh man, it's 10:30 and I need beer and cigarettes and snacks." It's like, "Oh, you're open. Awesome. You totally got me out of this jam. You dépanner." And so it became known as the dépanneur. And so I took over in Toronto. I took over what was an old corner store.
How so cool.
And I was a Montrealer, nostalgic for the difference of how my bohemian early artist days in Montreal. And I said, okay, I'm a nostalgic Montrealer with a corner store. I'm going to call it the Depanneur. But also, I thought that food in Toronto and maybe in general was a little bit en peine. And maybe I could le dépanner a little bit. And that's what I've been trying to do.
And I think you've done a really good job about that. Yeah, I wish I could have. And what are now that you're on a sabbatical, because you're taking a year off to write the cookbook and write the second book and other things, right? Whatever pops up into your agenda here. So where do you see it going?
Well, so just to clarify, 2 years ago, I was actually hitting the limits of this little tiny space. Like we were just packed every single day, all of the events, and the rent had essentially tripled up from under me. So even though I was content to just keep doing what I was doing, it was not becoming, I was sort of at the growth maximum. There was nowhere to expand and it was just rising. So I'm like, started to think a lot about where do I go next? And I got it, and I said, okay, I don't care if it makes more money. I don't want to work so much. It's just too much work. It's very hard. Right.
Right.
And so I spoke to my mentors and advisors and they were like, you might actually have to work less. You might actually have to make more money if you want to work less. And I was like, oh, okay. So I started thinking about expansion and new spaces and bigger things and economies of scale. And then I started to just get really overwhelmed. And I'm like, I can't plan and execute a whole new dépanneur while I'm running 300 events a year.
Right.
Right. So
because it's just you.
Yeah. I mean, I've had great people helping me throughout, but it was always 3 people worth of work and 1.5 people worth of revenue. Right. So, and so I kind of was looking at this, feeling stressed out. And then I said, you know what? You can't change the tires while the car is moving. You just got to park this thing for a bit, take a rest, think carefully and deeply about what it is that where I want to go with it. And then purposefully and intentionally work towards that. And I decided that. And then like 3 months later, COVID. And one of the interesting lessons was I was encountering all of these problems of growth that was like causing all of these challenges. And so I was like, I have to grow. And then all of a sudden I turned around, and had I actually got a new lease and doubled down on an expensive new build out and expanded and then walked into COVID with that, it would have been totally catastrophic. So ironically and perhaps profoundly, the smallness, which was what I was pushing against, actually ended up being the saving grace. And I could dial it back down to a one-man operation and navigate through COVID. And so when we were suddenly really constrained in what we could do in terms of events, I was en peine to dépanner the situation. I was like, well, what can we actually do if I start where I am, use what I have, do what I can? It's like, what can I do? And I said, well, I have all these amazing cooks that have been here through the last decade. Why don't we try to celebrate them in another way? So I had this idea of doing a cookbook showcasing 100 of these different cooks.
Mm-hmm.
And then I started doing my research and due diligence, and I discovered that probably the only thing worse than the restaurant business model is the cookbook publishing business model. It's just like an absolute disaster. So I became clear that, because one of the important things about the Dep is everybody always got paid, right? For what it was, shared risk, shared reward. If we had a great night, we both made good money. If we had a terrible night, we both took a hit. That was always the fundamental premise. So I wasn't going to do that for 10 years and then tell everybody to donate to the cookbook for free. So everyone was going to get paid to be in this. And with 100 people, even in an honorarium, right, there was, plus the photography, there was no way to pay for this using what I could expect to get from a Canadian publisher. So I said, all right, so we turned it around and went to the community, and we launched it as a Kickstarter. And the Kickstarter went on to become the most funded Canadian cookbook ever.
Wow.
And we sold more than 700 advanced copies and raised enough money to launch the whole book, and also to validate the project enough that I was actually then able to take it to a major publisher, just to several major publishers actually, and negotiate the backing of a publisher who would otherwise maybe be reluctant to give this relatively obscure first-time author a chance on the national stage. So it worked out really well, and it was really it is both built on and a product of the legacy of the last 10 years of the Depanneur.
That's really cool. And I'm so glad that, you've sold 7. I need to go buy one too. Put my money in that Kickstarter.
It's coming out in 2023. Exactly the beginning or the end, I don't know quite yet, because it is a very long, slow, involved process. And doing a anthology of 100 different contributors, some of whom have never used a recipe or English isn't their first. It turns out it's actually a lot of work. Who would have thought? But,
just you saying that, who's never used a recipe, just made it reminds me of Pilar from last week, and just talking about the food traditions. I'm like, when you invited those Syrian refugee women into the Dep to cook, they're just cooking what they know and what they love. And maybe they didn't bring...
do some of them know it? I mean, we're talking if you have 10 kids and 45 grandkids, you've been running a restaurant your whole life, right? These tattooed bearded bro is you can just mop the floor with that guy. So they sit down.
Oops. All right. Well, he's Len. You froze on me. I hope it's not me. So this is Len from the Depanneur in Toronto, and he's talking about the Dep and his book that's coming out. If anybody's commenting here and you can still hear me, let me know. If you can hear Len, let me know in the comments down there. And I'm going to post the websites and stuff now so that everybody can know how to get a hold of him. And let's see, that's the website, and then Facebook here. What I really, all right, he's going to come back hopefully in a second. We're going to find him on Instagram and such, but I really am impressed by, how he's pulled all of these individuals together to share their food culture and their food history with themselves and with the new communities that they brought in, but also these 100 different chefs from, professionals and amateurs that are just sharing their love. And I do what I've been talking about for a while is what he said is food is more than just food. And I've asked this question in my education sessions. It's it's the livelihood of somebody. It's the servers, the staff, here we go.
I'm sorry. It seems that either we have a power or a internet just stopped here. Okay. I don't know what it's. I'm now just managed to retether through my phone. I have my laptop. We're good for a little while.
Okay. So I was just talking about how, food is more than just food, and I've
Mhm.
posted all of your links on there, but you were, um, it's good. The book, you were saying the book is coming out next year,
Mhm.
and that's the way for us to buy it. But it's, we were talking about the recipes and
Mhm.
how, saving the traditions
Mhm.
of, these refugees who are coming to new cultures. And so they have to learn one, to cook with new food types for
Mhm.
one, possibly, with also, but their memory of
Mhm.
the dishes that they made.
Well, I mean, I knew I understood this in the abstract, at
Right.
one point, but then I remember in the early days of the Depanneur, we actually had a visitor from Anissa Halou, who's a very preeminent figure in the world of Islamic food. She's a famous cookbook author.
Uh-huh.
And she was speaking at the Terroir Symposium, which is a big food industry sort of thing in Canada. And she was the keynote speaker. And she had heard about the project and came to speak. To check it out. And when she spoke to me, and she made it really clear that the stakes here are high. That Syrian food is one of the most ancient culinary traditions in the world. I mean, we're talking tiger food of the Western world, and
Mhm.
it's a sort of unbroken just tradition that's evolved, and it's not owned by celebrity chefs and Michelin stars and fancy things. It's owned by these women and these mothers and these grandmothers cooking in their unique ways in their unique villages. And what happens to all of that knowledge when
Mhm.
6 million people are like thrust into diaspora around the world, and coming to a place where you buy hummus in a tub at the supermarket and no one's ever heard of this ingredient or that herb.
Mhm.
And it became clear that what we were doing, even though this wasn't the focus, was like we were communicating silently that this knowledge is valuable, that it's
Mhm.
and that people value it, and that they see value in it, and they're willing to pay for it, and encouraging them to, like, hold on to it. And so we, it became about something much more than just earning a little pocket money or
Right.
whatever. And then I started to think deeply about this too, that you don't get to have a culinary tradition for 5,000 years
Mhm.
unless that tradition itself can be repeated generation after generation after generation, that itself is a technology of sustainability on what can be
Wow.
extracted from your continually, generation after generation. And so I was like, well, what if we could reframe this whole thing? What if it wasn't about all the things we think we need to teach them about, getting a credit card or signing up for a cell phone plan or whatever nonsense? And we could just shut up for a second and actually listen deeply to what we might learn. And then, I mean, Canada's been here, what, like 300 years? I mean, look what we've done to the place. So it's like, if we could actually hear, we might actually get the most important lesson of our lives.
Oh, that's amazing. It really is. I mean, because it reminds me of my grandmother. She made this succotash. None of us know how she made that succotash, and she passed away 15 years ago. None
Mhm.
of us can figure out how to do it. And my other
Mhm.
grandmother, who passed away 3 years ago, I don't really know the recipes that she did, right?
Mhm.
And I really wish that I did. I mean, I have
Mhm.
my mom's recipes that she does, and I recreate those, but how do you it's a shame that
Mhm.
we don't have my grandmother's crab cake recipe and her
Mhm.
succotash recipe. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, they connect you, like, humanly and personally to that family, to that
Mhm.
tradition. And then more deeply embedded in those recipes are where those ingredients come from, your
Mhm.
relationship to them, the stories that they embody. And then in that is the politics and the history that shaped, those things. And
Right.
so, like, yeah, through those recipes, we connect to all of our human legacy.
Ugh, so amazing. I wish we could talk for so much longer. So before because we're getting up on that 40-minute mark,
Sure.
what is your favorite food and drink?
Now that's pretty tough, right?
Okay.
I mean, I don't know. I can talk about a specific dish, but I can talk
Mhm.
about the characteristics that it has. It's like I'm not necessarily interested in fine dining and elaborately plated things, food that's really expensive. The idea of, like, food as a kind of, like, status symbol really doesn't sit with me. So it's the food that it's made with love, that has a story that comes with it, It comes from somewhere. Either it comes from a place, it comes from a family, it comes from a recipe from your grandmother, whatever. And then it's made with this fundamental spirit of hospitality and generosity. And then you sit down and you share it with the people who made it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you have this experience that uses that food as the connector, that connects you to each other, to the stories embedded in things. That's where it happens. And that's what I tried to put on the center of the plate. When you have, one of the things I'll say about the Depanneurs event is we had communal dining, right?
Okay.
It was like a big table, you have 8 people, we put big platters on the thing, and everybody, it was the only restaurant I've ever been to where total strangers pass and serve food to each other.
Wow.
Right? It's a fundamentally different quality of experience. And it's not for everybody. Not everybody wants to go to a dinner party. Sometimes you just want to grab a snack, or you don't want to make small talk, chit chat with strangers. But how hard is it to find new friends and meet new people in a big city? So there's something else on offer. Food, like you said, is so much more than food. And that's, a big part of what I did. And I really hope to do more of that. And I guess now, another way of saying it is, I love to be, to eat in someone's home, wherever, anywhere in the world, try new things. And you can only do so much. And as the old saying goes, if Muhammad can't go to the mountain, then you bring the mountain to Muhammad. And so by hosting this 1,000 dinners, I brought the whole world into my kitchen and got to have those meals without ever leaving my city.
Oh, I'm just so impressed by you and inspired.
Well, thank you. That's very sweet.
You're welcome. Okay, so everybody, this is Len Senater, and he is the founder of the Depanneur. I said it right. In Toronto, he is taking a sabbatical to write a cookbook on his experiences at the Depanneur with 100 different cooks from around the world. So recipes from 80 different countries, etc. So check it out. I put the links in there in the bottom so you can find him, follow him, stay on track with his book when it comes out. And Len, thank you so much for what you do.
Oh, my pleasure. It's a lot of fun, and it's very tasty to do it.
Very tasty to do it. I would love to do that. Yeah. So everybody, thank you for tuning in. Thank you for listening to the Eating at a Meeting podcast. We are here live every Wednesday on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube. And every Tuesday, a new audio podcast drops onto your favorite podcast platform. So make sure that you download that. We've got 118 episodes published as of this week. So thank you for tuning in and checking us out. Until next time, stay safe and eat well. Oh, and for March, next week is March. So I'm going to do Women's History Month. So it's Women's History Month, and I'm highlighting 10 women who are doing really fascinating things in food and beverage. And they're from all over the world. And I can't wait to introduce you to these 10 fabulous women. So until next month, thanks, Len.
Thank you so much.
All right, everybody, see you soon.